Isla had spent 5 years in the Royal Cavalry, making sure no one noticed her. Then, in one night, she saved the king's life, and it was too late to go back to being invisible. She had always been like that. The soldier who worked twice as hard and asked for nothing. The one who could gentle any horse in the stables and still eat her meals alone, by choice, because unnoticed was safer than seen. She had built that life carefully, over years, quietly, with her own hands. Then, the east wing of the castle caught fire. By the time the flames were out, Isla had done what none of the king's own guards had managed to do. She had gotten him out alive, and nothing about that night had been as simple as it looked from the outside. She didn't know that yet, standing in the wet ash of the next morning. She only knew that the life she'd spent so long building, small, safe, unseen, was already over. Not because of what she had done, because of who had seen her do it. This is the story of a woman who was never supposed to have the king's attention, and the fire that made sure she did. Let me tell you how it started. Chapter 1. The bell that marked the change of watch hadn't rung yet when someone let herself into the stable, moving quietly and unhurried, careful not to wake anything that didn't need waking. Isla told herself she'd only stay a minute. Jupiter had gone off his feed 3 nights running, and the night groom wasn't due for another hour, and it was easier to check on him herself than to lie awake wondering. She found him in the back corner of his stall, head low, ears already turning toward the door before it finished creaking open. Still not eating. She ran a hand down the long plane of his nose, and he leaned into it, heavy and familiar. That much, at least, hadn't changed. She was still there when she smelled the smoke. It wasn't the kitchen's. Kitchen smoke faded once the ovens were banked. This only grew, sharper by the second, until she stepped out into the yard and saw light where there shouldn't have been light. Low and orange, spreading behind the windows of the east wing. 5 minutes before, there had been nothing. She would remember that clearly, later, when people asked how fast it had all happened. She crossed the yard at a run, into a crowd already spilling out of the castle. Grooms half-dressed, someone clutching a child who hadn't started crying yet, smoke rolling low across the stones like fog before first light. A steward stood frozen near the kitchen door, a tray still balanced in his hands as though he'd forgotten what it was for. Has the king come out? He looked at her like the question hadn't caught up to him yet. I don't know. It happened too fast. Nobody knows anything. That was answer enough. She went in through the service passage, where the fire hadn't reached, past a kitchen emptying itself through every door that led out, while she took the one that led in. By the time she reached the gallery outside the royal chambers, the east wing wasn't on fire anymore. It was fire, walls of it, ceiling of it, heat pressing against her skin like something with weight. She found the door more by memory than by sight. "Your Grace!" She hit it with the flat of her hand. Nothing. She hit it again. "Are you in there?" An answer came back, muffled, broken by coughing, lower to the ground than a king's voice should have been. Alive. And the door, iron-bound, built to keep enemies out, was locked. She didn't waste a second try on the handle. She pulled the pin from her hair and went to work on the lock the way her father had taught her on a broken tack box, back when she was young enough to think it was a game. 4 tries. It felt like 40. The door gave, and smoke rolled out around her ankles. Inside it, a man was already pushing himself off the floor. No crown, no guards, nothing to mark him as anything but someone who had nearly died in his own bedroom. His name was Cameron, though in that moment, black with smoke and coughing too hard to stand straight, he did not look like anyone's king. "This way." She got a shoulder under his arm before he could argue, and for a few strides, the king of Goldengate let a soldier from his own stables hold him up. They nearly made the stairs when they heard it. One frantic bark, from behind a shut door off the gallery. He caught her arm before she could move. "Leave it. It's too dangerous. That whole side of the gallery could come down any minute. No. She pulled free, already moving. Nobody stays behind, not tonight. The door wasn't locked, only shut. The dog was small and terrified, wedged behind an overturned chair, and it came to her hands without a fight, as if it had simply been waiting for someone to open the door. She had it against her chest before he'd finished objecting, and then there was no more time to object to anything. They ran, both of them, through smoke already climbing the stairs, out into air that tasted like something other than fire. They were still coughing it out of their lungs in the yard when the rain started. It came down wrong, too fast, too straight, too sudden for a clear night. And Isla knew, the way you know a held note is about to break, that this wasn't weather. She found the source of it a moment later. A woman standing apart from the crowd, arms lifted, a bright yellow-white light gathering and coiling between her open palms, before it lashed upward into the clouds, again and again, like she was stitching the storm into place, one thread of light at a time. Soaked through, she still looked less like someone caught in a storm than like someone conducting one. The fire hissed and folded under the water, wing by wing, until what had been a wall of orange was only smoke and blackened stone. She lowered her arms last of all, and turned toward the king with an expression already arranging itself into grief. "Forgive me," her voice carried, pitched to reach every corner of that yard. "I came as fast as I could raise it. A storm that size doesn't want to be called on a clear night. I should have had it sooner. I should have—" He caught her hands before she could finish, gentle, the way you'd calm someone already halfway to tears. "Morwenna, you did everything you could. No one is asking more of you than that." Morwenna had served the crown longer than Isla had been alive, advisor to the king before Cameron, and to the king before him, though age never seemed to touch her the way it touched everyone else at court. She wore, as she always did, a thin silver chain at her throat, a single stone of deep blue catching what little light was left in the yard. It was common knowledge, repeated so often no one thought to question it, that the stone was the source of everything she could do. That without it, Morwenna would have been just a woman, growing old like anyone else. Isla stood there holding a dog that wouldn't stop shaking, watching the king comfort the woman who had arrived last, and kept whatever she was thinking to herself. Morning showed what firelight had only suggested. Isla stood in what was left of the East Wing's outer hall, its ceiling open in one corner to a colorless sky, its floor gone black where black had never been floor before. Guards combed the wreckage room by room, calling numbers back and forth like men counting the dead, though someone confirmed it 3 times before she believed it. No one had died. Every servant who slept in the East Wing had gotten out. So had the king. So had the dog, currently asleep on a folded blanket in the stable, worn out from a night it wouldn't remember. She hadn't slept. There'd been no version of sleep that made sense, not with soot still under her fingernails and questions she couldn't put down. "You were in the yard before anyone raised the alarm." She turned. Cameron had come up beside her without her hearing him, which struck her as its own kind of unfair. After last night, she'd expected to hear him coming for the rest of her life. "I was checking on a horse." It sounded small, out loud, next to everything that had happened because of it. "He's been sick. I go most nights." Most nights. He said it like he was filing the fact away somewhere. "So you weren't meant to be near that wing at all?" "No." He looked at the blackened stone a while longer before he spoke again. "Then it's the second thing about last night I can't explain." She didn't ask what the first was. She didn't have to. They were both still standing close enough to the ash of it to know. By midday, the council had gathered to settle the matter, and it was Morwenna who settled it fastest. The guard captain had barely finished laying out what little evidence there was. A scorched doorframe, an unused sitting room, before she was already nodding along, already offering the explanation herself. A candle left too near the drapes, old dry wood, nothing more sinister than carelessness. It was tidy. It was delivered with more certainty than the captain himself had managed, and the council, eager for tidy, took it. Isla stayed silent in the meeting. No one had asked her to be there, and stable soldiers weren't generally invited into rooms with maps of the palace on the table. She found one of the king's household guards in the corridor afterward and said it to him instead. No one left a candle burning in a sitting room no one uses. She'd walked past that room 100 times carrying feed and never once seen its door open. And even if they did, candles don't burn sideways into a wall 3 rooms down. The guard didn't have an answer for that. Neither, when she found him an hour later, did the king. "Show me," Cameron said. So she did. Walked him through the service passage she'd taken the night before, to a black seam low on a stone wall where the fire had clearly started, and further than any candle should have reached. Neither of them said the word arson. It was too early, and neither of them wanted to be the one who said it first, in case saying it made it true. Cameron found her in the stable 2 days later, elbow deep in a bucket of something that smelled like it was meant to help Jupiter's stomach more than his opinion of it suggested. He didn't bother with a greeting. "The wall. The one you showed me. I had 2 more masons look at it. And? They agree with you. Nothing that starts in a hearth burns like that." He delivered it flatly, like a man reporting bad news to himself. "I don't like what that means." "Neither do I." He didn't leave after that, the way she'd expected him to. Deliver the news, be done with the stable soldier, go be a king somewhere with better lighting. Instead, he stood there a moment too long, watching Jupiter with the caution of a man who'd never been alone with a horse he wasn't required to ride. She nodded at the horse. "You can pet him. He won't do anything interesting." Cameron reached out and patted Jupiter's neck the way you'd pat a very large, possibly dangerous stranger. Stiff, official, 2 inches too high. Jupiter turned his head, and with total indifference tried to eat the king's sleeve. Cameron snatched his hand back like he'd been bitten by something with more teeth than a horse actually has. He does that. She was laughing before she'd decided to. He's not picky. He'd eat your sleeve, my sleeve, that door if we let him. No one warned me a king could be outmaneuvered by a horse. I don't think anyone expected you to try. He huffed something that was almost a laugh, rubbing at his sleeve, and for a moment neither of them said anything else. It was the kind of silence Isla noticed rather than filled. The kind that would have felt wrong, a week ago, with anyone else standing this close. She gave her hands something to do besides noticing how she was standing, and nodded at Jupiter. He's special treatment, this one. Extra mash, warm water, blankets he doesn't need. Half the grooms think I've gone soft. Have you? No. She considered that. Maybe. He was the first horse that was ever really mine to look after when I started. I wasn't going to lose him to something as boring as a stomachache. When did you start? Riding. Later than most. She kept her eyes on the bucket, not because the question was hard, but because answering it honestly meant not watching his face while she did it. My family had 1 horse. Old, half-blind, built for pulling a cart, not for anything a child would call riding. I didn't sit a real horse until I was 12 at the garrison, mucking stalls in trade for lessons nobody else wanted to give. That's late to want something that badly, or it's exactly why it never wore off. She glanced up. You don't get to want something for that long and then be casual about it once you finally have it. Cameron didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had lost the flat, reporting bad news register from before. "No," he said. "I don't imagine you do." She didn't know what to do with the way he was looking at her when he said it, so she went back to the bucket and let Jupiter save her from having to decide. A few mornings later, Cameron asked her to ride out with him. No stable business this time, no wall to inspect, no theory to test out loud. They rode past the tree line along a track Isla didn't know, until the castle behind them was nothing more than a gray smear against the sky, and the forest had gone quiet the way it does at midday, hooves the only sound for a long while. Neither of them explained where they were going. She didn't ask. The tree, when they reached it, was bigger than anything Isla had stood beneath before. A trunk wide enough that 3 people couldn't have circled it hand to hand, roots breaking the ground in long ridges like something that had simply decided, centuries ago, to stay. They left the horses tied at the clearing's edge and walked the rest of the way on foot. My father brought me here once. Cameron tipped his head back, following the trunk up into branches too high to see the tops of. I was young enough to be annoyed about missing a hunt for it, not old enough to understand why he cared. And now? Now I understand it. He was quiet a moment. He told me Goldengate wasn't built in a throne room. It was built in the forges, fire and ore and men patient enough to shape both without getting burned by either. He said this tree was the same lesson, only slower. Something that takes 100 years to grow doesn't fall in one bad season. That's a lot to put on a tree. He liked lessons that outlasted him. A short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. I understood it about a year ago, standing exactly where you're standing, 4 months into learning that a crown doesn't come with instructions. I've been coming back since. Something moved in the underbrush before either of them could say more. Isla went still out of old instinct, before she'd even placed the reason. What stepped out from beneath a fern was small and gray, except for a wash of lilac fur at the crown of its head, and eyes the same even, deliberate purple, a color that had no business existing on anything that ate grass for a living. She let out a breath. You don't see those. Ever. What is it? Luck. She kept her voice low, though the thing seemed in no hurry to bolt. That's what the old stories call them. If one shows itself to you, it means the luck's already turned your way. You just haven't noticed yet. Cameron watched it a moment longer, until it lost interest in both of them, and ambled back into the undergrowth. I suppose I really am lucky then. He wasn't looking at the place where the rabbit had been when he said it. The heat came up Isla's neck before she'd decided whether that was fair. She looked away first, found something urgent to check in Jupiter's girth that didn't need checking, and for a while neither of them said anything else. Not an uncomfortable silence, just one that neither of them seemed to know how to end. We should head back, she said finally, when the light had shifted enough to make it true. Should we? Cameron. It was the first time she'd used his name instead of his title, and she heard herself do it half a second after it was already out, too late to call it back. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't have to. She watched something in his face settle, quiet and pleased, like he'd been waiting for it without asking. They untied the horses and rode back the way they'd come, side by side, not talking much, which suited them both fine. The days after the ride to the tree fell into something almost like routine. Cameron finding reasons to pass through the stable yard that had nothing to do with investigations or masons. Isla finding herself less surprised each time he did. Neither of them named it. It was easier for now to let it stay the shape of coincidence. She kept working the horses, kept checking on Jupiter twice a day instead of once, and told herself the extra visit had nothing to do with who else might wander by at that hour. She was aware, in the vague way a person is aware of weather changing, that gossip moved fast in a small castle, and that stable soldiers weren't generally worth its attention. Which was, she suspected, the only reason no one had said anything yet. She was still fastening Jupiter's blanket one such night when she heard boots on the stone floor, too light and too unhurried to belong to the early groom, and hours too soon for him besides. Cameron stopped just inside the door, like he hadn't fully decided he meant to come in. He didn't have a lantern. He hadn't dressed for company either. No crown, no formal coat, just a shirt he'd clearly pulled on without thinking twice about it, the way a man dresses when he isn't expecting to be seen by anyone who matters. I didn't think you'd be here. The words came out carefully, like the sentence carried more truth than he meant to give away. I didn't not think it either. She let that stand without asking him to explain it. Couldn't sleep? No, I don't. Most nights, if I'm honest. I've gotten good at pretending otherwise. He came further in, hands finding nothing useful to do with themselves until he settled for leaning against the stall door across from Jupiter's. Isla went back to the blanket's buckle, giving her hands something to do that wasn't watching him. What's tonight's excuse? No excuse, just the usual. A kingdom that doesn't stop needing things at a reasonable hour. He watched Jupiter shift his weight, ears following the two of them without much interest. Sometimes it's easier to think somewhere that isn't the room where I do all my other thinking. And you ended up here. I ended up here. Something about the tone made her look up. He wasn't looking at her exactly. He was looking at Jupiter, watching the horse the way you watch something you've decided is safer to focus on than the thing you actually came for. She held out the curry brush without a word. He took it like she'd handed him something more complicated than it was, and got it mostly right on the second attempt, running it along Jupiter's shoulder in short, careful strokes. She didn't look up from the buckle. He knows when you're not paying attention. Horses do. All of them. You can't lie to one, not really. They don't care what you say, only what your hands are doing while you say it. That sounds exhausting. It's the opposite, actually. She reached over and adjusted his grip without asking permission, the brief contact gone before either of them could decide to notice it out loud. People make you work to find out what they mean. A horse never makes you guess. If he trusts you, you'll know. If he doesn't, you'll know that too. No performance in between. Cameron kept brushing, quiet for a while. My father used to say something like that about people. That most of them are performing something, and the ones worth keeping close are the ones who forget to. Anyone in the castle forget to lately? He almost smiled at that. Fewer than I'd like. She thought for one long moment about how easy this had become. Standing in a stable at an hour that belonged to neither of their titles, talking about horses like it was the only subject that mattered. She thought about how unfamiliar that ease still felt, and how little she wanted to examine why. You're staring, Cameron said, without looking up from the brush. I was thinking. About? Nothing that can't wait until morning. He looked at her then, long enough that the weight of it reached her before she'd turned to check, and he didn't press. That, she was starting to understand, was its own kind of answer. That he'd let her keep something to herself, when a king had every right in the world not to. They stayed until Jupiter's coat gleamed under the lamplight, and neither of them had any real reason left to still be there. And somehow that took another hour. Chapter 2. 2 days after that, the questions Isla hadn't been able to put down finally sent her back to the service passage, because looking was easier than admitting she couldn't stop. The mark was easy to miss, which was probably the point. Isla found it on her 4th visit to the scorched seam in the service passage, not in the burn itself, but just below it, cut into the stone rather than left by fire. A small, deliberate shape, angular, the kind of thing a mason might dismiss as an old quarry marking if he wasn't looking for anything in particular. She crouched and traced it with 2 fingers before she let herself believe it was real. 10 feet further along, low near the floor where a torch bracket had been, she found a second one. Different from the first, but related to it the way 2 words in the same sentence are related. She couldn't have explained how she knew that, only that she did. The third took longer. She nearly missed it in the dark of the stairwell below, and only found it because she'd started running her hand along the stone out of habit by then, the way she'd once learned to check a horse's leg blind, by feel instead of sight. She sketched all 3 on a scrap of feed ledger paper before she let herself leave the passage, copying every angle twice to be sure she hadn't invented anything out of shadow and wanting to. The library at Goldengate wasn't built for stable soldiers, and the man who kept it made that clear without ever quite saying so. But he also hadn't outlived 2 kings by turning away anyone the current one had personally thanked in front of the whole yard. So he let her in and let her stay, long after the good light had gone and he'd retreated to his own rooms with a lamp of his own. It took hours. Most of what she pulled down was useless. Old treaties, a genealogy no one had updated in 40 years, a bestiary with nothing in it stranger than a 2-headed calf. She was ready to give up twice. The third book she opened after that, bound in cracked leather and smelling like a cellar, had what she was looking for on its 9th page. The shapes matched, not close, exact, down to the angle of the smallest stroke. Runes of ignition, the text called them, old enough that the language around them had shifted since it was written. 3 symbols meant to be read together rather than alone. Used. The book was careful with its wording, the way old books were careful about things people had once been burned for saying out loud. To call fire, and to hold it, and to bend it to a shape it would not have taken on its own. Isla sat with that for a long time before she closed the book. Whatever had happened in the East Wing, it hadn't started with a candle. Someone had wanted that fire to burn exactly the way it burned, in exactly the place it started, and someone had known how. It was too late to knock on any door that mattered, and she wasn't foolish enough to say something this large to anyone but the king himself. She banked the library's dying lamp and folded the sketch into her sleeve, like something that might catch fire on its own if she wasn't careful with it. She thought of the stable out of habit, and then thought better of it. There was no reason he'd be there tonight. But she remembered something else instead, a line from a night that already felt older than it was. Somewhere that isn't the room where I do all my other thinking. If he wasn't sleeping, and he rarely was, that was exactly where she'd find him. She went to look for him there instead. The office door was ajar, firelight spilling into the corridor in a thin gold line, and Isla didn't bother knocking before she pushed it open. "Cameron, I need to—" The room was empty of him. Morwenna stood instead at the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel, watching the fire like it was something she had built, rather than something she was merely warming herself by. "He's not here." She didn't turn right away. Council business kept him longer than he expected. "I'm afraid you'll have to make do with me. I'll wait outside. You're in a hurry." Now she turned, and her eyes went, without seeming to search for it, straight to the paper crumpled in Isla's fist. "What's that you're holding so carefully?" Isla closed her hand around it before she'd decided to. "Nothing that concerns you. Everything in this castle concerns me." Morwenna's voice hadn't changed at all, still warm, still measured, the voice of a woman who had spent decades making people feel foolish for worrying. "I've kept it standing longer than you've been alive. Show me." I said it's nothing. "Then it costs you nothing to show me." Isla didn't move. Something in the room had shifted the moment Morwenna's eyes found the sketch. A stillness underneath the warmth, like a held breath waiting to see if it needed to become something else. "You found the marks in the passage." It wasn't a question. Morwenna said it plainly, almost gently, the way you'd confirm a fact you already knew, rather than ask one you didn't. I did wonder how long that would take. The fire behind her climbed a hand's width higher, though no one had touched it. Isla took a step back toward the door. "I think you should explain that to the king yourself." "I think I'd rather not." Morwenna's hand lifted from the mantel, and where her palm turned upward, a thread of red light gathered between her fingers, coiling the way smoke coils before it decides which way to rise. "You understand. I've spent a great deal of effort being subtle. It's tedious work, subtlety, and I find I'm no longer in the mood for it. Perhaps it would simply be easier to be rid of you here and be done with the whole matter." The door behind Isla gave a soft, final click, not the sound of a mechanism, but of something closing that had no mechanism to begin with. Isla didn't waste time testing the handle. She had one dagger at her belt, and she threw it, not at Morwenna's chest, but close enough to her shoulder to buy a single startled flinch, close enough that the red light guttered for half a second as Morwenna's attention broke to track it. Half a second was enough. Isla threw her weight against the door, before whatever had sealed it could finish deciding it was sealed, and it gave with a crack of old wood and newer magic, both losing their grip at once. She didn't look back to see if the dagger had drawn blood. She didn't think it had, and she hadn't meant it to, only meant to be gone before Morwenna finished deciding not to miss twice. She ran. She found him 2 corridors away, already moving fast in the direction she'd come from. Someone had clearly told him something was wrong, or some instinct of his own had caught it first. "She's not in the meeting." Isla caught his arm, breathing hard. "I need to talk to you. Morwenna isn't as good as she seems. Her intentions aren't noble, and her actions are even less so. Slow down." His hand closed briefly over hers, steadying rather than stopping her. "Breathe. Are you hurt?" "No. I threw a knife at her and ran." He was still trying to piece together what she'd just told him. He didn't get the chance to finish. "There you are." Morwenna's voice came from behind them, unhurried, as though she'd simply strolled the distance rather than followed it. She'd smoothed whatever the dagger had disturbed. Not a hair out of place, not a mark on her. Nothing to suggest the last 5 minutes had happened at all. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, and I'd rather clear it up before it becomes something worse. You locked me in your office and threatened to kill me." Isla didn't lower her voice to say it. "That's not a misunderstanding." "That's one version of it." Morwenna's eyes went to Cameron, patient, almost fond, the way you'd look at someone you expected to see reason before anyone else in the room did. "She came at me with a blade, Your Grace. I raised my hand to protect myself. Nothing more. I'd ask you to consider who's served this crown for generations, and who's been in your service for a matter of months. I know which of us has earned your trust. I don't believe the girl from the stables has whatever she's convinced herself she found." "Don't." Cameron's voice dropped, quiet in a way that carried further than shouting would have. "Don't speak about her like that. Not to me." Something in Morwenna's face went still, the patience draining out of it all at once, like a mask that had simply stopped being worth the effort. "Then you leave me no choice." Her hand came up, and this time there was no gathering, no coiling thread of light building toward something. The red came all at once, a bolt of it crossing the corridor before either of them had finished understanding what they were looking at. Isla didn't think. She reached the ceremonial shield mounted on the wall beside her, some ancestor's relic, kept polished and useless for exactly this kind of afternoon, and got it up between Cameron and the light a half-second before it would have reached him. The impact threw her back a full step, metal ringing loud enough to hurt, but the shield held, and so did she. Then she was moving forward, not back, straight at Morwenna, before the woman had finished drawing breath for a second attempt. The second bolt came anyway, faster and wilder than the first. Isla caught half of it on the shield's edge and let the rest go past her shoulder, close enough to feel the heat of it, and didn't slow down to consider how close. She closed the last of the distance at a dead run and swung the shield in a short, brutal arc that caught Morwenna across the side of the head before the sorceress could raise her hand a third time. Morwenna went down and stayed down, the red light dying out of her palm like a snuffed candle, and for a moment, the corridor held nothing but the ringing in Isla's ears and the smell of scorched stone. Cameron reached her before she'd fully lowered the shield. "Isla, I'm fine." Her hands were shaking. She let them. "I'm fine." He didn't say anything else for a moment, just stood there, looking at her like he was only now understanding what had almost happened. Then he pulled her against him, careful of the shield still gripped in her hand, and held on longer than either of them probably meant to allow. "Thank you." It came out rough, closer to his throat than his mouth. He didn't let go while he said it. "That day in the forest, when you told me about the rabbit, about luck." A breath, and then quieter. "I really was lucky. The luckiest thing that's happened to me since I took this crown was you crossing my path." The guards brought her straight down into the dungeon, no delay allowed between the corridor and the cell door, and the necklace was gone from her throat before the lock even turned, pried loose by hands that clearly had orders not to hesitate. There wasn't a hearth in this room, and Morwenna's fingers still twitched once toward her collarbone, an old instinct reaching for a flame that wasn't there anymore. The runes were cut into the floor around her, into the walls at shoulder height, an unbroken ring of them, a pattern as foreign to her as her own runes were familiar. Someone, Cameron, or whoever he'd trusted with the work, hadn't been willing to bet that the necklace was the whole of what she could do. The cell itself had been built to hold whatever might be left in her without it. That, more than the stone or the door, told her precisely how thorough he had decided to be. He came alone, and stood outside the bars a long moment before he spoke. "I want to understand it." No greeting, no accusation dressed as a question. "Not the fire. I understand the fire well enough now. I want to understand why." For a moment she said nothing, and when she did, there was none of the performance left in her voice. No grief, no warmth arranged for an audience. Just a woman, tired for reasons that had nothing to do with the hour. "I served your father for 11 years, his father before that, for longer. I built half the treaties this kingdom still stands on, and neither of them made a single decision of consequence without asking me first." She said it plainly, like someone reciting a fact they'd stopped finding remarkable. "You were crowned, and within a year you'd stopped asking. Not because I gave you worse counsel than I gave them, because you didn't need to be told what to think anymore. And I had spent so long being necessary that I didn't know how to be anything else." It was true, as far as it went. Cameron had leaned on her judgment his first months on the throne, grieving and unpracticed, with nothing else in the castle that offered him the same certainty. It was also true that he'd needed her less with every season since, and that Morwenna had never once mistaken that for anything but decline. "So you set my home on fire." "I set a crisis I intended to end. Cleanly. With everyone grateful, and me indispensable again. The same as I've made myself indispensable to every king this crown has worn since before your grandfather was born." Her jaw tightened, the first honest anger she'd shown him. "It went wrong. The fire wouldn't obey me. Nothing about that night went as I'd planned." She caught herself and didn't repeat the word. "That is the only part of this I regret. Not that I did it. Only that I did it badly." Whatever Cameron had expected, an apology, a denial, tears arranged to land somewhere useful, it hadn't been this. It was, though he wouldn't have called it that yet, the moment he finally understood what he was dealing with. Not a woman who had lost her way, but one who had never once doubted it. "You could have asked me to trust you more." His voice had gone very quiet. "You chose to make yourself impossible to live without instead. There's a difference, and I don't think you've ever learned it." "No." Something almost like a smile, thin and without warmth. "I don't suppose I have." He didn't argue with her further. He held up his hand instead, and let her see what was already broken in his palm. The silver chain, the stone shattered into 3 dull pieces, whatever light had ever lived behind its surface long gone out. Her breath caught, just once. "I did this so it can't be anyone's ever again. Not yours. Not the next person foolish enough to want what it gave you." He closed his fist around the pieces. "You don't get to be indispensable one last time, Morwenna. Not even in the breaking of it." She looked at his closed hand for a long time, and said nothing at all. By morning, she was gone from Goldengate, banished before the sun had fully cleared the eastern wall, with nothing but what she could carry, and no magic left to carry it any easier than anyone else would have to. A few weeks after Morwenna left Goldengate, the east wing was still more scaffolding than wall, but the yard had gone back to its ordinary noise, hammers instead of shouting, masons instead of guards combing through ash. Jupiter had gotten his appetite back weeks ago, filled out again, no longer the sorry thing hunched in the corner of his stall. Isla was checking his shoes, bent over with his hoof braced against her knee, when the yard went quiet behind her all at once. The kind of quiet that means someone worth noticing has just walked in. She straightened in time to see Cameron cross the yard toward her, not slipping in through a side door after dark, not waiting for an empty hour. In full daylight, in front of 4 guards, 2 grooms, and anyone else who happened to glance up from their work, the King of Goldengate walked directly to the stable soldier holding a horse's hoof, and didn't stop until he was close enough that everyone watching understood exactly what they were watching. "Your Grace." She set Jupiter's hoof down carefully, aware of every eye in the yard finding them both. "Is something wrong?" "No." He said it plainly, like a man who'd rehearsed being calm and found, now that the moment had arrived, that he didn't need to be. "Nothing is wrong. I came because I was tired of only saying certain things where no one could hear them." She heard one of the grooms stop what he was doing entirely. "Cameron, I know what it costs, doing this here instead of somewhere quieter." His voice didn't drop, didn't try to make the moment smaller than it was. "I know what the council will say, and I know what it will cost you. Being talked about by people who've never once properly thanked you for everything this whole castle owes you. I decided I didn't care enough about either of those things to keep pretending I didn't. Cameron, everyone's watching. Good." Something in his face had come loose, more open than she'd seen it, even in the stable at midnight, even under the tree. "I'd rather they watch this than keep wondering." He reached for her hand, and this time he didn't hesitate over it, didn't treat her like something that might startle. He took it like something he'd already decided he wasn't giving back. "You told me once that luck shows up when you're not looking for it. I've spent my whole life looking for it in the wrong places, treaties, alliances, everything with a crown attached to it. It was never there. It was standing in a stable, telling me a horse could tell when I was lying to myself." His thumb moved once over her knuckles. "I love you. I'm not interested in being quiet about it anymore." Isla didn't answer with words. She didn't have any that felt big enough, so she reached up instead and kissed him. In front of the guards, in front of the grooms, in front of Jupiter, who put his head over the stall door to observe the whole thing with mild, unbothered interest. Somewhere behind them, one of the guards started clapping before he seemed to remember himself, which only made 2 more join in. Cameron didn't let go of her hand, not once, not for the rest of that day. And by evening, there wasn't a soul in Goldengate who hadn't already heard. The wedding came in the spring, months later than either of them had planned it, and exactly on time for everyone else in Goldengate, who had apparently been planning it since the day the king kissed a stable soldier in front of half his guard. It was held in the Great Hall, banners in the old colors, doors thrown open to let in air that still carried a trace of new mortar from the East Wing's last repairs. The dog Isla had once carried out of the fire, fully grown now and entirely unbothered by ceremony, slept through most of it under the head table. When Cameron said her name in front of the whole court, not Your Grace, not the girl from the stables, just her name, said with the same plain certainty he'd first found in an empty stable at midnight, nobody in that hall doubted for a second that he meant every syllable of it. Skye arrived 2 years after that, in early summer, and decided almost immediately that horses were the only sensible thing in the world worth caring about, an opinion her mother privately considered the one argument in the family nobody had ever lost. On a morning that could have been any morning in Goldengate, and was exactly the kind Isla had once given up hoping for, Cameron stood in the yard with his daughter balanced on Jupiter's broad back, one hand steady at her waist, laughing at something only the 2 of them found funny. Isla watched from the stable door a moment before she went to join them. The King of Goldengate, the girl who would one day be its queen, and the horse who'd somehow become more a part of this family than anyone could have predicted the night he went off his feed. Some love stories begin with a crown. This one began with a hairpin, a locked door, and a woman who never once stopped to ask if she was allowed to run toward the fire. Goldengate still remembers it, if you know who to ask. I always do. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. The fire, the runes, the quiet moments in that stable that meant more than either of them ever said out loud. I think what I love most about Isla's story is how ordinary the bravest parts of it were. She didn't need a crown or a spell to change everything. She needed a hairpin, a decision not to leave anyone behind, and the nerve to keep showing up as exactly who she was. That's rarer than it should be, and it's why I keep telling stories like hers. If today is the first time you've found your way to this library, I hope it isn't the last. And if this story moved you even a little, a like or a share genuinely helps it find the next person who needs it. Thank you again for spending this time with me. With love, Evelyn.